Good morning. I'm recording this on March 9, Sunday, and it is cool but pleasant outside. It was 28 degrees, so I had to have a toboggan on as I went for a walk with the dog. This is the day the Lord has made, to be sure. I'm going to sing a verse of a song that is fitting for what we'll be talking about. Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. Take my moments and my days, let them flow in ceaseless praise. Let them flow in ceaseless praise. It has many verses. One of them says, Take my will and make it thine. It shall be no longer mine. Take my intellect and use every power as thou wilt choose. Every power as thou wilt choose. Our theme in this Lenten time that we entered Wednesday behind us was Ash Wednesday. The theme will be Jesus Christ colliding with our thinking. Some announcements. Next women's meeting will be March 19, and that's at 10 o'clock in the lower level of the church. March 30, we will host a Lenten gathering of soup, sandwich, and then worship for Lent. It's interchurch gatherings because prior to that, March 30, there's going to be a gathering tonight at Bethel, and then Elkton United Methodist, and then Holy Family, and after us, St. Paul's. And uh, so you are invited to all of that. We already have our next scheduled bluegrass concert, April 6th, and that's always the first Sunday in a month. But this month is with Joe McAllister and friends. Hope you can join us. Yeah. The reading comes out of Luke 10. And I'm going to summarize a part. There's a lawyer stands up and wants to know what's the most important commandments in the Bible. And of course, he's understanding the Old Testament. And Jesus makes a recitation of many of the Ten Commandments, and perhaps he gets interrupted, but as Jesus is saying that, the man says, "Oh, I've done all that, but who's my neighbor?" And this then is the story, followed by another little story that we will hear. Wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, getting into his story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. By uh, now, by chance, a priest was going down the road, and when he saw him, he passed on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place, saw him, but passed to the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, poured oil and wine on them, and he put him on his own animal and brought him to an inn, took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave it to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and I'll be back, pay you whatever you spend." Which of these three, Jesus said, was neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? And the fellow said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, Go, do likewise. And now a short reading, just right on the heels of that. Now, as they went on their way, he entered a certain village where a woman named Martha came to him into her welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by many things, so she came to Jesus and asked him, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to get up and help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things, but there's need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, and it will not be taken from her. The reading from Luke. Well, the beginning of Lent was just the Wednesday behind us. And to make the 40 days of Lent work, you don't count Sundays, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And you don't count the Saturday and Sunday just before Easter. Now, many people on Lent will give up something. You could call it a fast of some kind. And they do that to concentrate on God's gift of life and resurrection, death and resurrection for our lives. But they are allowed to rest from whatever it is they've given up on a Sunday, the 5 Sundays in Lent. They're considered little Easters. So if you then count up those five plus Saturday, Sunday, that would make the period a workout to 40 days. This year during Lent, I'm looking at how Christ collides with our bias. And I'll be talking about, bias, judgmentalism, selfishness, expectations, and priorities, things that we set as essential and must happen. And yet, Christ has a different view. To collide has a couple meanings. The first and obvious one is maybe a car hitting another car. I was a young lad, 4, 5, or 6, when my dad got in a collision. I was in the car, and I referred to it afterwards as we got in a wreck. My dad, my mom both corrected me to say, no, that was a collision. Okay. But colliding in that sense. There's another sense of colliding, and that's when our ideas don't match and we may get into an argument. So colliding, it's the, yeah, uh, contest between two things and hard-won things. In this series, we'll have an opportunity to appreciate that Jesus Christ can help us view things a little differently so that we can catch his way of thinking, his way of seeing. That's the purpose of those collisions. Indeed, we don't naturally think in the way God thinks, and we need help. We need the help of Jesus. This week, we're looking at how God challenges our biases. And the definition of bias out of the old Oxford Dictionary is prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared to another, usually in a way considered unfair. Okay. Well, today's gospel reading presents two examples. The first one, the first collision, is that of typical racial bias. And the other is a collision about how things should be done, our beliefs on that, the way we've been raised, etc. Back in the day, on that first example, Jews hated Samaritans. They hated them because they were a mixed breed, partially Jewish, people who'd been left behind in the exile, mixed with pagan foreigners. Those foreigners had migrated into the area when the area was left abandoned. And so Well, through the years, they had developed their own set of scriptures, partly Old Testament, but partly something different. And they had a separate and different place to uh, offer temple sacrifices, not at Jerusalem. These things really caused the Jews to hate them. To put it in our own context, for many years here in the South, black skinned folks were hated by Southern whites. Mostly, I think it was because they were fearful that after slavery, the blacks might take over. Um, for instance, former enslaved people were 55% of the population of Mississippi. They were 45% in Alabama and Georgia, and they were about 33% or third in all the rest of the South. That made white folks edgy. And that was the reason then that Jim Crow laws and extreme prejudice got established. Ever since then and up through about the 1940s, those laws were enacted. The bias was vicious and life-threatening. Well, back to the parable. The hero of Jesus' story then is one of these hated peoples, a Samaritan. The priest walked by, the Levite walked by. The Cotton Patch Gospel musical has a wonderful way of looking at that. One of those people says, "Oh God, I thank you that you have commissioned people to help people such as that," and walks on by. How many times have we thought, "Oh, somebody ought to help"? But the Samaritan gave him a hand. He cleaned the wounds. He carried him to an inn. He paid an innkeeper to tend him after he had to leave the next morning, and even promised to give him money if there was more cost. Yeah. And so the question was, who's been a neighbor to the Jewish man who's been hurt? And the answer was, well, the Samaritan was. And the point with Jesus is that we should all be neighborly to each other, all kind to each other. And so we need to then bring that to ourselves today. Who are the people who are hated or feared, or for some reason we have bias and prejudice against them? Well, there still might be some that it's racial. For many these days, it's migrants. Um, for some, it's homosexuals. Those groups being hated or feared or, extreme prejudice against them. And I'm not saying that Jesus would say we have to believe that what they're doing is right. He's just saying we need to be neighborly and kind, regardless of what they believe and do. Okay, well, that collides with the way we naturally think. And we're going to need to ask Christ to give us some different angles to look from so that we can understand what he means and how we should go about that. There could be many other examples of bias. I've just chosen a couple there. But who is it hard for you to love? Who isn't living right and you just do not approve and you just won't have anything to do with them? Jesus' thinking collides with us. It's intended to help us see the way of the Lord. Well, a second example then that comes to the story we heard about Martha and Mary. The interesting thing about that story is that it's not a parable. It happened in real life, real time, with Jesus present. Martha was happy to invite Jesus and his friends to come in and dine in her home, and she set about to be a good hostess. Meanwhile, her sister had a very different view of what being a good receiver is, and she was listening to Jesus, not helping Martha. My heart goes out to Martha. She had an idea of what being a good hostess was, and she was trying to get it done, and she was getting no help. Meanwhile, Mary was sitting at the feet of Jesus. It says, and here I'll get back to the story itself, but Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So she came to Jesus and asked, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. And here comes the hard part. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her. That's hard. Martha had a sound idea. It's gone down through the ages, through the centuries. That's the way a hostess should be. And Mary was not helping. She could have spoken to Mary directly, asking for that help, but she wanted to shame her. What a bummer that Jesus didn't agree with her, didn't help her, and shamed her. And I think it's really important that we understand that Jesus not only freed Mary from the usual women's work, but he welcomed her to be a disciple. That's important to understand. The lesson for both women and men, and I'm sure there are many men in that room who thought Mary should get up and go help, is that there is one thing that we need to focus on. That's worth our time, our attention, our meditation to focus on, well, Lord, what is that one thing? And how can I be more devoted to that? That should grab our attention. It demands it. Jesus collides with our way of thinking. Remember the way of the Lord. There's power in a word. That word remember is interesting to me. It means to remember, to put the legs and the arms back together, to reassemble. When we remember something, we are making it whole. We're putting it together, those scattered parts about it, and making it whole. To remember is the opposite of dismembering or tearing apart. To remember something for the good is a royal, holy, and spiritual act of kindness. Remember the way of the Lord. It's a blessing to the person and the thing that we're remembering, and to us. And so, as we remember that other people are also in God's image, we are extending a kindness to them. We're pulling their parts together and realizing them to be whole beings. They're not abstractions. They're not things on pieces of paper that we can just crumple up and throw away. Considering that second collision, that of honoring or not taking offense at how other people operate, we're remembering them as whole beings of God, too. They have a different way of operating. Not my way, we'll say, but we're remembering that they are whole and made of God. May God bless us as we willingly remember people as humans like ourselves who God loves. And may we remember no more bad, because to remember the bad is to welcome Satan into the room. And we don't want that. We want God in the room to remember for the good. May God's collisions with our hearts be helpful and welcomed by us as we walk forward in our walk with the Lord. remember the way of the Lord. Amen. Look forward to seeing you again. Bye bye.